My name is Maria Alter, and I'm 45 years old. I'm a worship leader, and I'm here to share something incredibly important that happened to me, a life-changing experience that I can no longer keep to myself. It all began on February 9th, 2023. That morning, the roads were treacherous after an ice storm the night before, but I was determined to make it to our 6 a.m. prayer meeting. As a worship leader, I felt it was my duty, but at the same time, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling I'd been carrying for weeks about our worship ministry. Something was off, though I couldn't fully explain it. I was driving, my mind tangled with these thoughts, when everything happened in an instant. I remember seeing the headlights of a semi-truck as it jackknifed on the icy highway. Then, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I wasn't in my car anymore. I was hovering above it, watching the paramedics work desperately to save my life. The scene below me was frantic, but I felt no fear. Instead, I was wrapped in an overwhelming peace, as if all my worries had faded away. Then I saw it, a brilliant light unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't the harsh lights from the emergency vehicles, but a warm, living light that seemed to be filled with love and life. Drawn toward it, I became aware of a presence beside me. I turned, and there he was, Jesus Christ. His presence was beyond description. His eyes held an eternity's worth of depth, and in them, I felt both known and completely loved. Maria. He spoke my name, his voice deep and resonant, vibrating through my very being. I've brought you here because you need to understand something crucial about worship in my church. I couldn't speak. I was just in awe of his presence. He continued, showing me things that would change the way I viewed worship forever. What he revealed to me was both beautiful and heartbreaking, and I now feel a deep responsibility to share it. As I stood there, still in awe of being in Jesus' presence, he took my hand and gently led me forward. In an instant, we were no longer in the physical world. Instead, I found myself in what I can only describe as a spiritual observation room. I could see countless scenes unfolding before me, all at once. What I was witnessing were worship services happening all over the world, in churches big and small, but there was something profoundly different about how I saw these services. I wasn't just looking at them with my natural eyes. I was seeing into the spiritual realm as well. Jesus looked at me and said, "Maria, I need you to see what's really happening in my church." At first, it seemed like a typical worship service, one I could have walked into myself. I saw a large modern church with all the bells and whistles, moving lights, elaborate stage setups, a polished worship team, and a sound system that delivered perfect audio. Everything looked flawless by earthly standards. But then I began to notice something strange in the spiritual realm. Dark shadows seemed to move through the congregation, swirling between the people and around the stage. These shadows weren't just abstract. They were demonic entities, feeding off the pride and self-focus of some members of the worship team. I gasped, asking, "Lord, is this what's happening in my church too?" Jesus didn't immediately answer me. Instead, he said, "Watch more." And suddenly, we were transported to my own church. I saw myself leading worship. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I realized something I hadn't noticed before. While my voice was singing about God's glory, my mind was preoccupied with the technical aspects of the service. The lighting effects, the video team, the camera angles, everything except the presence of God. Jesus spoke softly, yet with authority. Do you remember Lucifer's role in heaven before his fall? He was the leader of worship, created for the very purpose of guiding all of heaven's praise toward me. But his pride led to his downfall. He continued, "The enemy knows the power of worship better than most of my children. He can't stop it completely, but he distorts it. He shifts the focus ever so slightly from me to human performance. That's what you've been feeling, Maria. The unease you've experienced is a sign of a deeper problem in the church today. At that moment, I realized how right he was. All the distractions, all the focus on perfection were taking our eyes off of what really mattered: authentic, heartfelt worship. And it wasn't just happening in my church, it was happening everywhere. Jesus turned to me and said, "Maria, I want to show you something that is happening in many churches today. Pay close attention." With a wave of his hand, the scene shifted. We were now watching a high-production worship service at a large contemporary church. At first glance, it looked incredible. Everything was meticulously planned. The lighting system created dramatic effects, and the sound system delivered music so crisp that every note seemed perfect. The worship team performed flawlessly, their movements synchronized, their voices harmonizing beautifully. It was all so polished, so impressive. I could hear the music, feel the energy of the crowd, and see the smiles of the worship team as they played. But as I looked deeper, I began to notice something unsettling. Though everything appeared perfect on the surface, there was a spiritual emptiness. The people in the congregation were moved emotionally, yes, but there was no depth to their engagement. They were caught up in the spectacle, distracted by the lights, the sound, the visuals, and the performance. Their focus was on the entertainment value, not on connecting with God. Jesus, sensing my confusion, explained, "Look closer, Maria. Do you see how the technical aspects are taking precedence? The sound engineer is more concerned with achieving the perfect balance of frequencies than with the spiritual atmosphere in the room. The lighting director is obsessing over making the lighting more impressive, trying to create an atmosphere that will wow the crowd. Even the worship team, though skilled, is caught up in making sure their performance is flawless rather than engaging their hearts with me." I felt a weight in my chest as I watched. I could see the pride in some of the team members, their focus shifting from leading people into God's presence to making sure they looked good, that their performance was perfect. It was subtle, but it was there, pride creeping in, clouding their hearts and taking their attention away from God. "Worship is not about perfection," Jesus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "It's about offering your heart to me. It's about creating space for my presence to move, not about impressing others or showcasing your talents." When the focus shifts from me to human performance, pride begins to seep in. The enemy uses this to distract and distort the true purpose of worship. As I listened, I realized how much I had been guilty of this myself. I had been more concerned with how the service looked than with whether or not I was truly leading people into God's presence. The technical aspects, the perfect sound, the impressive visuals, they all became distractions, and I had allowed that to happen. Jesus paused and added, "This is why I brought you here, Maria. It's time to restore worship to its true purpose, to make it about me and not about performance." As Jesus continued to guide me through this spiritual revelation, I could sense that the atmosphere had shifted. There was a heaviness in the air, something I couldn't quite grasp at first. Jesus turned to me and said, "Maria, I want you to see the unseen, the forces working in the background, influencing so much of what you're witnessing today. Watch carefully." With that, the scene before me changed. We were still in that large church, but this time I was able to see beyond the physical. As I looked around, I noticed dark, shadowy figures moving through the congregation. They weren't visible to the human eye, but I could feel their presence. These were demonic forces, and they were at work, subtly manipulating everything in the worship service. I watched as they slithered between the worship team members, whispering in their ears. Their whispers were quiet but insistent. The sound engineer, for example, was so caught up in getting the perfect sound mix that he was completely disconnected from the spiritual atmosphere in the room. His focus wasn't on guiding the people's hearts toward God, but on achieving technical perfection. These dark forces whispered, "Make it perfect, make it flawless. If it's not perfect, it won't be good enough. You'll disappoint the people." The lighting director was also under their influence. The shadows seemed to wrap around him as he worked tirelessly to create an impressive visual experience. "Make it brighter, make it flashier. You need to outdo the other churches. Make them talk about this service," they whispered. Instead of using the lighting to enhance the worship, it became a distraction, a performance in itself. The entire atmosphere was being distorted, and I could see how the focus had shifted from God to human perfection. Then I saw the congregation. It wasn't just the worship leaders and technical team who were affected. These dark forces were manipulating the hearts of the people in the pews as well. They weren't actively involved in worship. Instead, they were spectators, caught up in the emotional manipulation happening around them. Their eyes were glued to the stage, waiting for the next big moment, the next emotional high. The demons fed on this. "Look at how they respond to the music, to the lights, to the show," the shadows whispered. "They're feeding off of it. They don't even realize they're being distracted." I felt a pang of grief in my heart as I watched. The very tools meant to help people encounter God, music, sound, light, and even the presence of worship leaders, had been twisted into something dark. The focus had shifted from the Creator to the created. I saw how pride and the desire for fame were at play, even in worship leaders who were once pure in heart. Some of them had become consumed by the need for recognition, social media followers, and fame. They were performing, not worshiping. The demonic forces fed on this desire for attention, knowing that it distracted the leaders from their true purpose, leading people into the presence of God. Jesus, sensing my distress, gently spoke, "Maria, these forces thrive on distractions. The enemy knows that if he can keep people focused on technical perfection, emotional manipulation, and the desire for fame, he can dilute the true purpose of worship. Worship is meant to bring people closer to me, to engage their hearts and spirits. But when it becomes about performance, about the perfect show, about being seen and heard, it loses its power. The enemy loves this because it keeps my people from truly encountering me." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But the beauty, Maria, is that these forces can be overcome. True worship, worship in spirit and truth, can break through this darkness. It's when my people stop performing and start truly seeking my presence that the enemy's influence is broken." As I stood with Jesus, he gently motioned for me to look closer at the worship tools, the very things that were meant to create an atmosphere for God's presence. "Maria, these tools," he began, "are not inherently bad. In fact, I've given you the ability to create beautiful sounds, lights, and visuals to enhance worship. But when they become the main focus, when they are prioritized over the spiritual atmosphere, that's when the enemy steps in." I watched as the scene around me shifted once again. This time, I could see how the technical aspects, sound systems, lighting, and even the latest technology were being used not to glorify God, but to create a spectacle. The sound engineer was no longer focused on the heart of the worship. Instead, he was obsessed with getting every frequency perfect. His mind wasn't on the people, on their connection with God. It was consumed by achieving a flawless sound. The same was happening with the lighting team. The lights, which were meant to complement and enhance the worship experience, had become the center of attention. They were focused on creating a show, not a sacred atmosphere. The lights flashed and moved in sync with the music. but I could see that they were drawing attention to the performance, not the worship. The lights became a distraction, pulling the congregation's focus away from God. Jesus spoke again, his voice steady but filled with concern. These tools were meant to serve worship, Maria, not to control it. When worship leaders and technical teams start to prioritize perfection in their craft over spiritual sensitivity, they inadvertently create a barrier. Worship becomes a performance, a show to be watched, rather than an offering to be experienced. People become passive spectators rather than active participants. I could feel the weight of his words. The very tools that were designed to usher in God's presence were now tools of distraction. Instead of the congregation being led into a deeper connection with God, they were caught up in the emotional highs created by lights, sounds, and visuals. They weren't engaging with the Holy Spirit, they were being entertained. The enemy, Jesus continued, knows that if he can shift the focus away from the heart of worship and onto human abilities and performances, he will take the power away from my people. True worship isn't about how well you can sing, how perfect the lights are, or how emotional the music sounds. It's about creating an environment where hearts are open to me. But when worship becomes about the show, it leaves people passive, disconnected from the very presence that was meant to heal and transform them. Jesus paused, letting his words sink deep. The tools aren't bad, it's the heart behind them that matters. Worship must always be centered on me, not on the performance or the perfection of the tools. As I stood there with Jesus, he gently guided my focus to something that broke my heart. The songs being sung in churches across the world. Maria, he said softly, listen carefully to the words of these songs. And as he spoke, the familiar melodies I had heard in worship services over the years began to fill my mind, but with new clarity. Many of these songs, Jesus continued, are shallow, focusing on emotions and feelings instead of biblical truth. They stir up excitement, but they don't anchor people in the deep realities of my word. I could see it so clearly now. The songs were so often about the worshiper, their feelings, their experiences, their desires, rather than about me, my nature, and my glory. Jesus showed me how some of these popular worship songs, while emotionally powerful, lacked any real theological depth. They were more about the personal, emotional experience of the worshiper than about the truth of who I am. True worship, he explained, is meant to be grounded in my truth. When songs are written without a foundation in Scripture, they lead people away from the fullness of who I am and focus them inward rather than upward. Then he turned my attention to a deeper issue, the commercialization of worship music. The industry has become about making hits, about creating songs that will sell well and get played on the radio. Worship leaders and songwriters often choose songs based on their marketability, not on their spiritual depth. Jesus' voice was filled with sadness as he spoke. The heart of worship is being overshadowed by the pursuit of fame and financial gain. Many in the industry are more concerned with how many streams or downloads a song gets than with whether that song is truly lifting my people into my presence. I could see it clearly now, the influence of commercial interests in the worship music scene. Radio stations, record labels, and even church leaders were prioritizing songs that were catchy, easy to sing along with, or that had the potential to go viral. These songs became popular not because they were rich in biblical truth, but because they fit neatly into a marketable mold. The enemy is using these commercial pressures to dilute the power of worship, Jesus said, shaking his head. Worship is not about numbers or popularity. It's about offering me your heart, not your platform. I could feel the weight of what Jesus was revealing. These songs, while they might sound beautiful and stir emotions, lack the depth and substance that should be at the core of worship. "The focus has shifted, Maria," Jesus said with a tender look. "It's no longer about truth. It's about what sells, what's popular, and in that, the true power of worship is being lost." As Jesus continued to guide me through these revelations, he took me to a scene that was so different from the others, so simple, yet so powerful. He showed me a small church, a place with minimal technical setup. There were no flashing lights, no intricate sound systems, no grand stage productions. It was a modest space with a humble congregation. But as I watched, my heart was stirred in a way I couldn't describe. "Maria, look at this," Jesus said, motioning toward the scene. "Do you see what's happening here?" I watched closely, and what I saw was nothing short of beautiful. The people in this church weren't distracted by the latest technology or by concerns over the lighting or sound. They weren't worried about the stage design or the camera angles. Instead, they were fully focused on God. Their eyes were lifted in worship, their hearts engaged with the Lord. I could feel the warmth of genuine adoration filling the room, and I saw something incredible. Their worship was reaching heaven. It wasn't perfect by the world's standards. It wasn't polished or slick. The sound wasn't flawless, and the visuals were simple, but the sincerity of the worship was palpable. I could feel the presence of the Holy Spirit so strongly in that place, and I knew this was true worship. Their hearts were fully surrendered, and it was clear that their devotion wasn't dependent on any external factors. "Look at how they prepare," Jesus continued, and I was shown something profoundly different. Before the service began, I saw the worship team huddled together, not rushing through rehearsals or technical setups, but praying and seeking God together. They were opening the Bible, sharing what the Lord had spoken to them, and genuinely seeking His guidance. The priority wasn't how they would sound or how the service would look. The priority was being with God, seeking His heart. I could feel the difference. While the larger churches were preoccupied with technical perfection, here in this small church, the focus was on prayer, scripture, and humility. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was simply about being in the presence of God, lifting Him up, and surrendering to His will. "This is what true worship looks like," Jesus said softly. "It's not about how much you have or how professional it seems. It's about the heart, the sincerity, the humility, the devotion. This worship is pure and powerful, and it reaches heaven." As I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a deep longing in my own heart. I knew that this was the kind of worship that pleased God, worship that wasn't about performance, but about genuine love and devotion to Him. It was a simple, beautiful truth that spoke volumes. And in that moment, I realized how much we've missed in our pursuit of perfection. True worship isn't about the show, it's about the heart. As we stood in that simple church, surrounded by genuine worship, Jesus began to reveal to me the solution, the way to restore true worship. He looked at me with such compassion, as if He knew the depth of my heartache over what I had seen in so many churches. "Maria, you have seen the problem," He said, His voice filled with tenderness. "Now, let me show you the way forward." He explained that worship could be restored, not through grand productions or the latest technology, but by returning to the heart of worship, the heart of prayer, spiritual preparation, humility, and a deep commitment to biblical truth. "Maria, worship begins with prayer," Jesus continued. "Before you even step onto a stage, before you turn on the sound system or adjust the lights, your heart must be in alignment with me." Worship leaders need to be people of prayer, people who are seeking my face, not just their next song. Prayer is the key to preparing the heart for worship. It is in those quiet moments of communion with me that you receive the strength, wisdom, and direction for leading others into my presence. He paused, and I could feel the weight of His words. "Worship leaders," He said gently, are called to be spiritual guides. They are to lead people into my presence, not just to put on a show. The people are not there to watch a performance. They are there to encounter me. Worship leaders must remember that their role is to draw the people closer to God, not to themselves. It is not about impressing anyone. It is about helping others connect with the heart of the Father. Jesus then spoke about the importance of spiritual preparation. You cannot lead others into my presence if you are not spending time with me first. Worship is not just about the music. It's about being filled with my Spirit. When you prepare your heart through prayer, fasting, and the study of my word, you will lead people into an atmosphere where they can truly encounter me. He also emphasized humility. Maria, humility is the foundation of true worship. It is not about who sings the loudest, who leads the most powerful song, or who can stir the emotions of the congregation. True worship is about humbling yourself before me and leading others to do the same. It is about recognizing that I am the one worthy of all praise, not you. Finally, he spoke about the power of biblical truth. Worship must be grounded in the truth of my word. It is the word that transforms hearts and aligns them with my will. When you focus on truth, worship becomes more than just an emotional experience. It becomes a powerful declaration of who I am and what I have done. As I listened, I felt the weight of what he was saying. The solution to the problem of distorted worship wasn't about technical fixes or grand solutions. It was about a return to the basics: prayer, humility, spiritual preparation, and truth. Jesus was calling worship leaders to lead with integrity, with hearts fully surrendered to him, and to guide others into a place where true worship could take place, a place where God is honored and his presence is felt deeply.